We're going to take maybe 3 or 4 minutes and look at some aspect of Kansas and its African American history, or some prominent African American historical figure who lived or made a name for him or herself in Kansas City, Kansas. So we're going to start with that Black History moment, and then we're going to segue into the poetry component. I was made aware that some of you had already started working on your worksheets. Please don't do that because we're going to get to that place together, and by the time you start working on your worksheets, the conversation, the poems we will have read, all of that stuff is going to give you a lot more to work with when it's time for you to actually start writing your own poems, okay? All right. Now, just double check, everybody got a pencil? Everybody got a handout? Everybody has a poetry folder, right? Okay. Need one more handout? All right. What do you need? Folder. And we need a poetry folder over here. Poetry folder over here. Right, so the Black Archives, as I mentioned, is a research institution. We've got all these historical documents, we've got photographs, we've got rare and out-of-print books, we've got old Buffalo Soldier uniforms, we even have an old Ku Klux Klan uniform. We've got all this amazing material in our collection, and people from all over the country come to research and learn more about the history of this region. And the period of time that we cover is from 1850, prior to the Civil War actually, up through 1991. And what I wanted to talk about today, with it being October, we're coming upon, here's what I'm trying to say, the anniversary of the historic battle. It was called the Battle of Island Mound. So, the Battle of Island Mound took place on October 29, 1862. So that was during the Civil War. So back then, some of you might enjoy history, some of you may have talked about this in your history class, but was Kansas a free state or a slave state? It was a free state. Kansas was a free state. Missouri, was it a slave state or a free state? Slave state, that's exactly right. So, Kansas and Missouri bordering one another, what do you think happened? If Missouri is a slave state and Kansas is a free state, there was a lot of friction and tension, especially along the border. All right, so there were several men who escaped from slavery, primarily from Missouri and Arkansas. They came to Kansas to be free. They even sometimes used, are any of you familiar, there's a place here called the Quindaro Ruins. So that was one of the stops on the Underground Railroad, and the Underground Railroad, of course, was a system by which people who were escaping slavery had safe havens in people's houses, and other ways that the people on the Underground Railroad had these stops to help people make it to free states. So Quindaro was one of the stops on the Underground Railroad. Some people were trying to move further north, some people settled right here in Kansas. And a lot of those men who did felt like they wanted to fight in the Civil War. They wanted to fight for their freedom, but at that time, in history, it hadn't been legalized yet. There were people of color, there were African American men who were in the military, but they weren't given weapons, they weren't trained to fight. But there was this man, Captain William Matthews, who was in Leavenworth, and he started training up a regiment of volunteer soldiers because he was sure and confident that at some point that African American men were going to be allowed to fight in the war. So he began training them. There were 200 of them, and they called themselves the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry. And they were training, and they found out about a group of guerrilla Confederate soldiers. So the Confederate soldiers were fighting for slavery. They were the ones who wanted slavery to continue. The Union Army wanted slavery to end. So of course, William Matthews was training these men for the Union Army, but they hadn't been accepted yet. So as they were training, they came across a battalion of guerrilla Confederate soldiers, 600 of them. So these 200 informally trained soldiers went up against 600 men who had been trained and who had been prepared for battle, and they won, right? And they fought valiantly. And so word got back to President Lincoln about this small group of African American soldiers, the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry, that fought this Battle of Island Mound and won. So this is an artist's rendering of what took place that day, and it was in a popular magazine at the time called Harper's Weekly. And shortly thereafter, President Lincoln signed the Military Act of 1863 that finally allowed African American soldiers to fight in the Civil War. But the first time African Americans ever engaged in battle in the Civil War was because of the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry. And the battle took place about 80 miles south of here, Bates County. It's like a little bit further past Belton when you're heading out 71 South. But anyway, on the Kansas-Missouri border, 80 miles south of here. So, did anybody know that? I didn't before I started working at the archives, and I'm learning about how much history that had national importance happened right here in Kansas. And so we're going to be talking about that at the beginning of every poetry session. All right, so now